Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to what I think is probably most people's last session of the day. Not quite, strictly speaking, the last thing on the timetable. Welcome to a session about screwing up. We have started as we intend to go on. We have made our first failure by notching up quite a healthy-sized audience. I'm tempted to ask quite a lot of you to leave, so this session looks like a bigger failure, because failure and the ability to learn from it is our theme this evening. I'm tempted to say that I have a panel of people who are leading world experts in screwing up. That would be unfair. But both members of this panel have done plenty of experimentation and learned from it. On my left is Andy Carvin, who has been involved in more online initiatives, online journalism initiatives than most of us can count. But he came, I think, to worldwide prominence in 2011 when he was curating Twitter feeds about the Arab Spring. He was busy with verification and curation. Somebody christened him the man who tweets revolutions. He has donated, I love this detail, the iPhone that he used during the Arab Spring to the American Historical Museum. He's been working since 2014 as the founder of Reportedly, part of the First Look group that's doing global social media reporting. On my right is Mark Little, who probably doesn't need that much introduction to this kind of audience. He worked originally as a reporter for Radio Telefís Éireann, the Irish public service broadcaster. He founded Storyful, social media news agency, if I may abbreviate it like that. It was bought by News Corporation. And Mark now works doing media partnerships for Twitter in Europe and Africa, based from Dublin. We're not going to do open presentations. We're going to do a bit of conversation up here, and then we're going to throw the conversation open. I'm going to assume that both of our guests think that a certain amount of experiment and failure is a necessary and natural thing. I'm going to make a further assumption that there is a bit of a gap, however, between people who talk a good game about experiment and learning from failure and what they actually do in practice. People hate admitting mistakes, however much the management textbooks might say that you've got to experiment to learn and you've got to fail. So I'm going to start with Andy and ask you, Andy, when people talk to you about experiments and failing, what are they likely to get wrong?
I think one of the most common things that they get wrong is that they're going to probably lose their job over failing. It never ceases to amaze me how much reticence there often is, especially among junior to mid-level staffers at news organizations who have the skills and the ideas and the know-how to break the mold a bit and try new things, but are utterly terrified of their editors or their producers because it's been hammered into them that the brand is everything. Always protect the brand. For many years, I was at NPR, National Public Radio, and like many legacy news organizations, protecting the brand is considered highly important. But as I discovered, as I got myself onto certain social media platforms before they did, I figured, well, there's nothing that could go wrong for them because they have zero presence here whatsoever, so why don't I make a fool out of myself as A. Carvin and see where things go? And yet, when I talk to other staff about at news organizations trying to get them to even try incremental experiments, they want to hold meetings. They want to get all sorts of levels of approval. They basically want something written down to prove that there's plausible deniability to protect them. And it's really unfortunate because I think some of the most exciting things that have happened in social media in the last 10 years were because certain people just didn't give a shit and they wanted to try things.
Give us an example of something that broke all the rules.
Something that broke all the rules. Well, let's see. Think back to the days of Flickr. Very early on, when Flickr launched, they didn't really know what they were doing. They thought of themselves as a group of friends who wanted to play games online, and they would do it through sharing photos and identifying photos. No one was going to do anything like this online, of course, because bandwidth was such a huge problem. But yet they figured, well, if people are going to be uploading photos to the system as a game, we might as well make it easier for them to organize it. And of course, other companies that specialized in photography and galleries and the like all thought this was a bit insane because, of course, bandwidth would never become cheap or ubiquitous. But they stuck to their guns and became one of the largest photo networks in the world. And now, of course, they're falling apart, which is a whole other set of failures because they were on the cutting edge and then they forgot learning how to adapt. And so it's unfortunately one of the many examples of people who for a period of time are on the cutting edge and are among the people who don't give a shit. But because of incumbent powers and the bureaucracy that often comes around when being purchased again and again and having to appease shareholders, the spirit of wonder vanishes from the organization. And next, you're struggling with whether or no this archive you've been working on for the last 10 years is even going to exist by the end of this year.
So they stopped experimenting?
They got complacent. They could have been Instagram, but they didn't want to do that because who would want to make square photos with filters on them? That, you know, absolute balderdash. And they got completely played by them. And within, 120 days of the company launching, Instagram got bought for $1 billion by Facebook, and Yahoo continues to swirl around the edges of the toilet bowl.
What a terrible epitaph to have on your gravestone. Mark, you're listening to a media executive, and they're talking to you about experiments and how you learn from failure and so on. What's going through your head about the most likely mistakes this person is going to make?
I think, my experience might be, every experience of failure is completely subjective. There are no objective rules about this. My experiences were formed, I suppose, by the transition from journalism into the world of startups. The first thing I would say, that transition is a completely unnatural transition. It's like you're left-handed, and you've now got to be taught to be right-handed. Because clearly, as Andy says, the culture of failure in journalism is death sometimes, to your reputation. You fail on the front page of a newspaper, you fail, you've got libel, you've got reputational damage. You cannot accept failure in journalism itself, in the act of journalism. And yet you have to now, as a startup, as an entrepreneur, completely embrace failure. And I think there are two things to say. First of all, it is absolutely essential that we really get to grips with this conversation and we embrace it. But at the same time, I think we have to be aware of the simplistic notions of failure that are out there. I've only ever learned from my failures. I can say that categorically. Never learned from my successes. And therefore, I understand the importance. But at the same time, I started out quoting Sam Beckett. Being Irish, I'll always look to Sam Beckett for inspiration. He, in Worsted Ho, said, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. And I used to go around quoting that at conferences until someone reminded me that the next paragraph of that of Worsted Ho, he completely recants. And I said, oh shit, I'm going to have to come up with a more complex notion. And what I did when I thought about it, looking back, I can't believe my business Storyful succeeded. I just can't. And I don't know why it succeeded. And when I realized there was 4 basic types of failure from which I learned and got better. The first is what everyone talks about. It's innovation, iteration, the process of product development. It's critically important there. But more important is the mental game. And the first thing is starting out. You make so many mistakes. I remember the first name for my company was Crowdflash, which someone said to me, well, what, Flash? Publicly exposing yourself?
In a crowd?
In a crowd. So, so that was one of the things. The second thing was, even starting out, you have to future-proof yourself. You have to know what the eventuality or the probability is 4 years hence. So when I sold the company, there was a mistake in the share options we'd allocated to our staff, where there was a mistake made that threatened the acquisition of the company in the last 24 hours. And so you have to understand every single detail that you start out with because it will affect the eventual outcome of your business. The second thing is team, and I don't want to emphasize this too much. There's so many things there that are kind of truisms. But I think the first thing I realized was values. I think I realized that if you don't employ on the basis of a consistent set of values, you will crash. So you almost tend to hire for what you don't have. So at one point, we were all creatives, all journalists. We knew we needed somebody who would talk truth to us, a salesperson who would be the old swashbuckling type. Christ, that was such a bad move, because this person was not consistent with our values. And as you go on, you realize that you have to have an absolute come-to-Jesus moment of failure to get over a very clear human flaw. So we tend, when we're under attack, to think with our lizard brain, the back of your head. And at some point, you have to move into that more hopeful, leaning forward part of your brain. My come-to-Jesus moment was when, in my first round of investment, I realized on Christmas Eve one year, the first year, that I'd chosen the wrong people. And I wrote to them on Christmas Eve. It was a heavy snowstorm in Dublin. And I said, I'm sorry, but this is the wrong fit. And I got into a car with my wife to drive home the west of Ireland to my family. I couldn't tell her. I was so embarrassed. The business was over. And I don't know if you know Chris Rea, the singer. He has a song called Driving Home for Christmas. About the 16th time I heard that in the car, I turned to my wife and I said, it's failed. She was okay with that. So I had a sense of exhilaration. I got to my family's house, I checked my email, and the lead investor said, no, I'm not accepting no. I'm going to do this. We're going to give you more money. And I was back again. Now, what it taught me was, once you accept that failure is, an option here, once you realize what's the worst can happen, in my case, getting another job, you start to realize you will never fear again. Because you've confronted the worst fear, the consequence of failure. It's okay. And that's when you get liberated. I mean, briefly, I'll just finish off, but I think two other areas are, what happens when you grow? You get confident. That's the other source of failure. In my case, I didn't really understand the idea of cash flow. I had contracts worth 40 grand, but the money wasn't coming in. It took 3 months for payments. And my investors pointed out that we were 6 weeks away from bankruptcy. And he said, I need you to cut your costs by 30%. I had to fire 5 people in one day within an hour. One of my best friends, 14 years, we'd worked together. And I was so ashamed because I had basically, in many ways affected their lives by making a basic mistake about things like cash flow. And I grew so much. I'm not proud of that. But I tell you what, I grew as a person as a consequence of that. I think we could talk about the innovation part and the iteration part, but there basically what I'm trying to say to you is, this is a mental game. Failure is about your personality as much as it is about controlled failure. Finally, I would say, George, I think the first thing to say about here is, if you can avoid failure, do. We're not recommending this. The best thing is not to fail. But then again, when you do, how you react to that as a person is absolutely critical to your journey.
It is all the same liable to happen. Andy, when you hear people talk about fail fast, how do you react to that? Should they be trying to fail fast?
Well, I think some people love the alliteration of the phrase and treat it as this mantra that you have to learn from your mistakes so quickly that you sometimes jettison things that maybe if you just give it a little while longer might have actually worked out. Now, granted, when you are testing new products or you're experimenting with new journalism techniques, you don't want it to drag out forever if it's not doing well. But after a while, when something isn't going well, there's often this human tendency to go into denial and to keep either throwing money at it or throwing capacity at it, whatever it might be, until you almost need an intervention from others to make you realize that it's time to stop doing what you're doing. I often think of when news organizations have screwed up with reporting something incorrectly. Unfortunately, there are a number of occasions where what they end up doing is kind of turning inward and not knowing what to say publicly and not knowing how to react. And sometimes hours pass, days pass, weeks pass, and then they'll release a letter from a statement from the editor essentially apologizing for the mistake. But by then, the damage has been done. With a bit more confidence and a bit more transparency about how people within an operation make mistakes, they can begin the process of healing that relationship with the public, and at the same time getting a better handle on how to avoid making the same mistake again, rather than coming up with yet another PR plan to cover your ass.
Mark, you said quite rightly, obviously, people don't want to screw up on the front page. But I can think even of editorial failures which must have taught an organization something. I'm thinking about CNN and the Boston bombings. I mean, they made a series of mistakes so bad picking up social media that I think their editorial practices will have changed. So there are even some failure learnings there, aren't there?
I think generally no. I'm not going to make a generalization that I just have actually, but part of the problem is, like in the case of, let's say you live in a sort of a country where there is a general sense of censorship, you tend to self-censor. So the act of censorship generally is not a crass intervention. It's generally people feeling like, well, I'm not going to get away with this. And what tends to happen in organizations, particularly in journalism, that have failures, there's a first process of victimization where a culprit's identified and there needs to be a head to roll. And I think that tends to be the case, in my experience, with a lot of journalistic organizations. You have to draw blood before you learn the lesson. You tend to have investigations that can be quite formal into the failure. And I think, yes, in most cases, in many cases, an organization that is mature will eventually come up at the end of it all with lessons that do change your sense about what happens next. But the process to get there, it can be a fearful process and can spread fear within the organization. And organizations are not good enough at saying, particularly around positive product development, technological focused innovation and experimentation, that it's okay to fail and you will not be punished. So it is changing. I can't speak to the editorial part of the equation, but certainly when you take a risk on something relating to technology, I do feel because of the desperation of these major organizations to change, you do get, at least in a small scale, and fail fast and fail small, constant small iteration. There is definitely that culture, I think, emerging.
Andy.
I can give an example of what it's like to go through an immense fail on the editorial side of things, because I was part of it. Some of you might have heard of the case of a member of Congress in the US, Gabrielle Giffords. In January 2011, while meeting with some of her constituents, someone showed up with a gun and began shooting up the scene, killed a number of people, wounded over a dozen, and Gabrielle Giffords was shot point blank in the head. And so NPR was fortunate to have a family member of a news director from the local station near where the incident happened, and so they were on top of things very quickly, and they were able to start discussing things on air about the assassination attempt happening. But then, as the top of the next hour approached, and this is when, the top of the hour they do a newscast, one of our reporters got word that she had died in surgery. And of course, that would be horrible news, but needed to be confirmed one way or another. So frantically, they reached out to another member of the team in Washington, D.C., saying, we need to get another source on this. And so they began calling around the offices of members of Congress, and pretty quickly, again, just a couple minutes before they got to the top of the hour, they found a second source saying that she had indeed died. And so when the bell hit the top of the hour, the newscaster went on air and announced the death of Gabrielle Giffords. This immediately went out through AP and Reuters and CNN and a number of others, quoting NPR. NPR runs on a bit of, at least at the time, ran on a bit of a ghost ship on weekends where not many people were staffed there. And I was really the only social media employee at the time. And so I was eating with my family one weekend when I saw the email alert come in from NPR headquarters that she had passed away. So I did what any other loyal NPR staffer would do. I copied and pasted that message, went to the NPR News Twitter account, which had about 1.5 million people on it at the time, and passed along the word that she had died. Needless to say, that spread around the internet very quickly. But within about 30 seconds, I started getting messages from journalists and colleagues all over the place saying, we're hearing the exact opposite. Where are you getting this from? The last we heard, she's actually in surgery and they think she might survive the night. And so I was able to quickly go onto Twitter and saying, we're now receiving conflicting reports. We'll report back as soon as we know more. Now, because I was on Twitter, I could jump in anytime I needed to update the story. But because NPR ran on a clock, it wasn't until the top of the following hour that they acknowledged that there were conflicting reports. And it wasn't until the hour after that that they completely walked it back. And it wasn't until another 24 hours later that they explained the mistake. Interestingly, the controversy at the time was that this was a massive social media failure on our part. And certainly, my tweet amplified and accelerated this horrible piece of misreporting on our part. But the hardest thing for NPR to really get a hold of when it really sat back and thought about what happened is that this was a fundamental reporting failure. It wasn't a specific platform. It was a cascading mistake that started from the very beginning, one after another. There should have been checks in place to have stopped it, but nothing did. And that was the true failure that we ended up learning that day.
If you have to fail fast, correct fast. Before I throw this open, I'm going to ask one very short, quick question to both. What organization, Mark first, do you think experiments and learns from experiments well? News media organization. If you have to hand the palm to one.
Wow, that's a really tough question. I suppose, in one way, I'd turn this around and say, anybody who has a vested interest in a personal brand, a journalist, and who's connected with a community, like Andy. Andy's probably the perfect example of this, where I think, I've said this before, I think the coin of the realm, the basis of a good journalistic brand individually, is the level of your engagement with the community that you serve. And the best examples, I think, in journalism of people who have learned from the idea of experimentations are those that are open, as Andy has described, to being corrected in real time. Because the basic reality is in social media, there has never been a communication platform that can communicate mistakes and hoaxes as quick as social media. But there's never been a platform in the history of the world that can correct and fact check as quick as social media. And I think those that understand the need for engagement to build their credibility, the fact that there's no respect for authority, there's only respect for authenticity, and people who accept that they will make mistakes but will be corrected if they engage directly with those who know more than you. So I'm sorry to avoid your question about institutional journalistic brands, because I do feel the lessons I'm learning are from people in big authoritative brands who take a risk, break the rules, and are probably seen as loose cannons in their newsrooms.
You want to name anyone?
Andy Carvin. Sorry.
Okay, okay, Andy, you get to name somebody, but you can't nominate yourself because you've already got it.
Okay. WNYC and the Center for Investigative Journalism. WNYC is the local NPR station in New York City. Historically, NPR has had the reputation of moving at a snail's pace in terms of innovation, and things have improved drastically over the last 10 years. But when you look at a local station trying to figure out ways of innovating in their own community and connecting with that community, I think WNYC has done a great job. Similarly with the Center for Investigative Journalism, that they have a culture of doing these enormous investigative projects, but then trying all sorts of creative ways of looking at the data, writing software to see if it can perhaps shed light on something in a new way. And one thing I think they both have in common is I think some of the people there, they come from the culture of makers, folks who believe in tinkering and testing, and if something catches fire accidentally, they get excited, and once they put the fire out and fix their singed eyebrows, they quickly blog about what went wrong. And those are the people I love, because they never get aggravated by the setbacks, because they, whether they articulated it or not, they still learn something from the process, and they're willing to keep at it again and again and again until they get it. And I think in these two cases, you have relatively small organizations, but that are punching well above their weight.
Okay, I hope we have microphones going around the room for people who want to ask questions. If you do get my finger pointed at you, please tell us who you are before you ask your question. We're open. Yes, over there. Microphone coming.
Hi, I'm a journalist from the U.S., and I'm not sure if this is related to failure or fear about protecting the branding, but why do you think that print media was so reluctant over many years to embrace social media, to get out in front of it, to use technology to its advantage? Do you think that's related to fear or just ignorance, or not sure?
Mark.
Thank you.
I think part of it is the mythology that grew up around the old newspaper journalists with the sort of pork pie hat, the press card sticking out, who ran for the telephone or the telegram to communicate the great scoop and, you know, basically fought the system. Like, I remember the Gabby Gifford story, and I remember the tweet from a local journalist saying in uppercase caps, "She is not dead." And I remember it's probably one of the people that Andy saw as well. And about 2-3 months later, well, maybe a little longer, you remember The Newsroom, written by Aaron Sorkin, the drama? I hate that so much, because this particular episode, in that fictional account, Gabby Giffords is not dead because some intrepid journalist on the team just decides to make the last minute phone call to save the broadcast, and social media in that case is castigated because it's spreading the rumor. And again, because Aaron Sorkin mythologized the main character, you know, who's this abrasive, like he's depending. And I think part of that is the fundamental failure to realize that the ability to sustain quality journalism and the essential values of the old style is dependent on a mastery of social media. And I think we're waking up to that fact. I'll give you one particular example of a failure and a success. There was a last-minute interview with President Mubarak before he resigned, and it was conducted by Christian Amanpour, and I won't name the journalist, but a BBC journalist. And it was a scoop for CNN. It was a sort of an exclusive for CNN, because Christian Amanpour was on Twitter, and she tweeted immediately after the interview, and the poor BBC correspondent was not. He joined Twitter very quickly and is now a very prolific tweeter. But, you know, again, there was the sense, and I'm sure he felt that, social media debases me and the old values, when in fact, the old values are you serve a community. And they are sustained, that value, I think, more and more by an embrace of the dangers of social media, but ultimately the fact that it makes you a better journalist. That's why I'm sitting here. I was so skeptical of Twitter when I first joined, but it made me better. And I soon found that there was the opportunities there to uphold, ironically, the mythological values of the old pork pie hat and the Ed Murrows and the great journalists of the past.
Andy.
You know, if you look at legacy media in general, so print as well as broadcast, I think one of the reasons they came so late to it is because from their perspective, they were doing well with their journalism. It's something that they had honed. You know, personally, they had honed over decades of work, but some of these news outlets went back many, many decades, sometimes well over 100 years, and they had a routine in place that as long as they do it exactly like this, we're going to produce solid journalism, so don't bother us with anything else. And so as some of the early social media tools and other things came along, I mean, even way before that, I mean, experimenting with listservs and bulletin board services in the late 70s and early 80s and 90s, I mean, there were only so many folks playing around them then because they didn't want to rock the boat. You know, they wanted to make sure the print run happened on time, that they hit their peg at the top of the hour. And then when the business models for each started to fail, as advertising started shifting away from legacy media and not really going anywhere from there, as the panic began to set in, I think there was a period of time where some of them blamed social media, or they tried social media briefly, got scared of it because of the potential of damaging the brand even worse, and then avoided it for a while. Now, this is one extraordinarily gross generalization I am making here, of course. But I think there is often a pattern when you compare people who are, and systems that are more comfortable with being experimenters and early adopters, they're more likely to sense risks and opportunities around them. Whereas entities that tend to be much more conservative, not politically, but with the system as it works, even potential benefits can be seen as a threat for a period of time. And I think that's what happened in many cases with a lot of news organizations.
Can I just add to that as well? Sorry, one thing I realize is that a lot of legacy media make a decision because there used to be only two sources of revenue, advertising and circulation, that to replace that, they need to find an equally small number of revenue sources. And therefore, they make these big bets on things like paywalls because their mentality tells them, if we lost this big source of revenue, there needs to be another big source of revenue, when in fact the solution lies in multiple iterations around tiny things like the load time of your article or how you counter ad blocking. And so therefore, they're not used to the concept of thinking about rapid, agile innovation. They're looking for the great big silver bullet. And I think that's part of the reason why they fail in many cases, because they invest in the kind of Friendster, MySpace, and then suddenly before they know it, that analogy, or Betamax versus VHS.
I'm going to step out of the chair for a second and just tell you from my own experience that I think the failure was at the beginning, I'm talking really about the 1990s here, was because established media misread social media and indeed digital media in general. They thought that they were adaptive change, they were a new form of distribution, and they wanted to fit everything they did into the template they already had. And that was completely wrong, because it's a transformative change. It rips up absolutely, well, more or less everything. And it wasn't until they got that established media really realized the depth of the change they were involved in. Right. Over there. Coming up. Microphone coming. No, this one over here. Microphone is coming. And we'll go over there next.
We need a catastrophic failure of communication system here, a microphone. This is going too well.
I can drop it if that helps.
Drop the mic. We're going to do it at the end.
Okay. I'm Georg Dahm from Germany, and actually we called our startup Fail Better Media, and so far we have been quite true to our name. Still going. And that's why we're interested in how your experiences with failure have determined your career path. I mean, it seems to me that you have chosen quite different ways. You moved from being an entrepreneur to an employee, also a very glorious employee, and for you it was basically the other way around. So I was just wondering how you process failure, and if you have become more risk averse or risk what's the opposite of averse? Risk friendly over the years. How that has influenced you.
Mark.
So I think first of all, the problem I had was that my friends, when I said this, you fail better thing, then I sold my company, and I did very well out of it, and I invented a protocol, the fail to fail protocol. So that's how I defended myself. And when I moved on from there, the next step for me, moving into a corporation like Twitter, and I'm only 3 months in there, so I haven't had the chance to fail significantly yet. But the one thing I realized is that if you're an entrepreneur, it gives you great skills when you move into an institution. Because, for example, how you rally a team. So I have a team of about 35 people across the region here. And I realized a lot of the leadership qualities that I brought to the big corporation came from my failures. I'll give you an example. There's a big mistake you make when you're a manager, particularly a CEO, that you say, we're a family. You say that to your staff because we really are connected by values. And that's a terrible thing to say because you're not a family. So I got a reminder of that when I was going through a particularly difficult period with Storyful. And, I sent out a memo to everybody saying, come on, stick together, we're a family. And I got a reply from one of our staff, a senior member of the staff. He said, you're not family. I'm not family with you. My family is my 2 kids last weekend and Saturday who had to lock outside the door of my bedroom as I responded to your desperate need for a change to the P&L of the company. That's my family. And so I read a lot about it afterwards, and I realized, I think it's Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn, has a particularly good example of this. We're allies. What you really are is you're in the trenches for a tour of duty in a startup, and you essentially then have a different relationship based on truth. And you actually get closer bonds in some regards when you go through that kind of situation. So for me, coming into a corporation, whatever difficulties you face, with your team, you can say to them, listen, our back's against the wall, we believe in the product, and we believe in ourselves, and let's give ourselves a time window to succeed. And that's a great feeling. And I transferred that from my failure in a startup into what I hope is success in a bigger corporation leading a team. So in a big corporation, management and leadership are two very different things, and my qualities of leadership have been honed by awful experiences of failure when I was in a startup.
Andy, random zigzag or careful planning? Your career?
My life is a pure zigzag. I didn't even know if I was a journalist up until the time that I started Reportedly, because so many people over the years have insisted that I wasn't. There was a lot of resistance to me when I came to NPR back in 2007, because they saw me as this quote-unquote blogger, which was not a nice word from their perspective back then, who was there to disrupt things. And all I wanted to do was tinker with stuff and basically stay out of their way and have them stay out of my way. And for the most part, that worked really well. And then I'd find allies here or there in different parts of the organization, and we'd work on interesting projects. And then the Arab Spring happened, and I spent almost 2 years deep diving into social media as a reporting tool. But then as I stepped away from that, I found myself spending a lot of time doing the stuff a lot of other social media staff in journalism do, figuring out how to do a better job on Facebook, how to improve the numbers of the communities and things like that. And then I suddenly had this realization that I had become completely complacent when it came to why I started doing this in the first place, and that I had allowed this notion of working in online communities go from developing relationships to figure things out to trying to optimize a transaction with them. And I didn't want to have transactions with the public. I didn't want to measure engagement through retweets and things like that. I mean, to me, real engagement would be things like, were we able to work with members of the public to break a story that had real impact in their communities? And so I eventually decided to leave NPR and start Reportedly, basically as a way of putting a stake in the ground and saying that those of us who are working in the social journalism space don't have to spend our lives being sucked down as social media marketers, and that we can actually use social media to occasionally improve the quality and diversity of journalism out there. And I don't think I would have learned that lesson unless I had allowed myself to drift for a little bit as well.
I think there was a question.
But that person right there is.
And we will come to you next. But you need.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Maya. I'm an American journalist living in Berlin. I wanted to hear from you guys basically sort of what you think needs to happen next in terms of innovation in the media sphere. Because what I've seen, I know the American media market best, I'm not sure what it's like elsewhere, but what I've seen basically is every single media outlet these days is hyper-focused on social media engagement and trying to become more like BuzzFeed, and it's really just kind of disgusting and icky to look at. So outside of trying to do that, I mean, what does, even legacy journalism outfits, like what do you think they are not doing enough of?
I'm going to switch the sequence and start with Andy.
Okay. I think everyone went from being scared of social media because of the impact it would have on their brand to being scared of social media that if they don't do things much faster, that they're going to lose. And they look around the world and see the BuzzFeeds and AJ Pluses and Vocatives of the world. And, oh, we need to do exactly what they do. We need to do optimized buzzy stories. We need to crank out 30 videos a day and have at least half of them go viral with a minimum of 500,000 views per day, but preferably 2 million, blah, 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 blah. And they create this state of panic that turns everyone into robots. Now, occasionally profitable robots, but robots nonetheless. But the thing is, you can only create so many organizations like that and be successful. You're going to have the handful of ones that really do it well, and all the also-rans who end up laying off half of their staffs because they suddenly feel like they need to pivot from one direction to another. And no, I'm not talking about an organization that rhymes with hashable. But unfortunately, that's what happens. Everyone tries to figure out how do we latch on to what we think is the next big thing, but the next big thing has already happened. So why not just figure out who the hell you are, who you serve best, work on that mission, and make good journalism, and empower your people to do a good job. And yeah, it's not going to be easy. You might be scratching by with a bit of money for a while, but do what you have to do to make good content, and don't just become another one of these optimization monkeys.
got a funny feeling that Mark's going to agree with you.
Yeah, I'll fail to disagree. Choosing to put it that way, you put your finger on a really interesting thing. I think that first of all is a failure to understand a basic principle of physics, the Heisenberg principle. Right now, I'm going to translate this in a way that most physicists will disagree with, but it's the idea of watching the object and missing the momentum. You spend too much time looking at the success of a BuzzFeed, and what you realize is that the actuality of your business is 2 years ahead. And actually, the only time that you're succeeding was nobody knows what the fuck you're doing, right? That people are like, why are you doing that? Well, you know, that means that you're ahead. You're not looking to be the next BuzzFeed. The next big thing is being invented right now in some basement by a 17-year-old in Manila. You know, so you've always got to be thinking about not where it is, but where the momentum of your audience is going. Second thing is the dictatorship of data. So, you know, confirmation bias means when you see a bunch of analytics telling you that you've got 10 million clicks on a certain platform, you have the confirmation bias that means I've got to put more furry cats up. When in fact the momentum is that if I have 10,000 clicks on something and 20 minutes engagement with what was clicked on, the value is enormous from that. And it's starting to be recognized, and we're starting to talk about clocks, not clicks. So I think that's something is don't look at your data to confirm what you already do, and don't be locked into it because data is very complicated. I suppose, you know, from my point of view, those are the two big things, is that just be very careful about presumption on the basis of what is. You have to understand the momentum going on in particularly user behavior. There's a third thing I've failed to remember, but I'll come back to it.
Right, we failed to take any questions from this side. No, there isn't a single hand. Okay. Where am I going? Yes, over there.
Hi, my name's Una. I'm a journalism student at Cardiff. I was just wondering if you were going back into quite a traditional newsroom today, particularly broadcast, how would you convince an editor that it might be okay to experiment?
You're the broadcast journalist X.
Nothing succeeds like success. You know, like in the bottom line is an editor will not recognize the need for innovation or unless you have some needle that's moved as a consequence of your experiment. So the first thing is, you know, obviously seek forgiveness, you know, not permission. That's the first thing. But choose something where, first of all, it's small enough that it doesn't bring down either the reputation or the financial performance of the company. Don't tell anyone you're doing it. Try to get a cross-functional team, not just a developer, or not just if you're a developer, you know, people like you, get someone from business development, and make sure you have a data point that's real to move. And if you can have a needle move a small amount, and you go to your editor and said, if you gave me a team of 5 people, that needle would start moving dramatically, and that may be something you can integrate into the infrastructure. A final thing, I just remembered my third thing. The problem many people have and editors have is they think the developer should be put out into the, you know, a room outside of the newsroom, when in fact the thing that a newsroom can learn is agile development techniques, which is the concept of those iterations of maybe 2-3 week sprints with a scrum master who essentially brings together a team of many disciplines like biz dev as well as development, and then essentially starts moving needles because they have very clear data points, retrospectives, and it really suits editorial. The problem that stops it is that basically, with all respect to developers, like journalists are ADHD, they're attention deficit. Oh, there's a new thing. And developers are kind of Asperger's. They're just headphones on and they're down on the task. So it's very difficult to get these two psychological profiles to work together. When you do, around small experiments that move needles, the result is sublime. It's greater than the sum of the parts.
I was in the product development panel today, and whatever else they might disagree about, they all agreed that if you don't have a cross-functional team, you're unlikely to get started. Andy?
I agree, excuse me, I agree with everything that's been said, so I won't pretend to make up any other good ideas, but I will add a warning, I think. Trust your instincts and get a sense relatively quickly if there's any hope for them. Not every news organization or every broadcaster is going to make the transition successfully. And I know a lot of good people who fought a good fight at organizations to ultimately not accomplish anything except extend their jobs and be in a bit of misery during that time as they tried to innovate, but were just banging their heads against walls. I think if you get a sense in a newsroom that their traditional habits of how they work, potential arrogance towards new ideas, if that is so ingrained in them, it's not likely that they're going to change anytime soon. So I would probably first just ask myself, what am I even doing here?
Yep.
Hello there. My name is Ezra. I'm working for VRT, which is a public broadcaster. And a question, maybe also Andy knows this from experience. What if you're too big to fail? You know, like you're a public broadcaster, there's big expectations, and they don't like you to experiment and fail.
Well, I don't know how well I can answer this because public broadcasting in the US is structured very, very differently than it is in Europe, especially in the sense that public broadcasters in America have no resources whatsoever. The government barely gives them a dime. About 1 or 2% of their budgets actually come from the federal government. And so even though they historically have been traditional in how they operate, they also at least are able to see that eventually they need to be more nimble. NPR was early on experimenting with podcasts, social media, working with PBS, the public television network in the US. They developed a system known as an API. I don't want to get too technical, but it's basically a way for different databases of stories from all around the US for different NPR and PBS stations to talk to each other to make it easier for that information to flow and allow people to localize their content more easily, or have a story that may start local and let it grow nationally. They're doing these things not because they're really geeking out on innovation. It's that they're also trying to figure out how they're going to be around in 20 years. They've already had that come to Jesus moment, knowing that we have to try these things or ultimately we're going to be in trouble. It doesn't always mean that they do a great job at it, but the writing's been on the wall for a long time, and at least they were lucky enough to put the glasses on before it was too late.
So I spent 20 years in the public broadcaster, and one of the things I realized is the failure is to recognize the advantages you have over private broadcasters, which is essentially that you are generally more secure. You have a deeper connection because of your public service mandate, and particularly regionally, to connect with communities because it's your obligation. Therefore, you are actually connected more, I suppose, to the emergence of digital communities because that's what you have to serve. And as people's activity moves on to social and your obligation is to connect with communities, you actually have an advantage there. Now, some smaller organizations like YLE in Finland has been identified as a particularly innovative broadcaster, and it's much more local. So I think you've got that advantage. You've got lots of different advantages. Public service broadcasters who do radio call-in shows were the original social media, and I think you can emphasize that. The big failures are that I've been to public service broadcasting conferences where we hear more about BuzzFeed and what the big thing is. We want to be more like them, more than I do from industry conferences where it's dominated by private broadcasters. What tends to happen is a lot of the we blame a lot of editorial conservatism on failures. One of the things is the dictatorship of the canteen when you walk in and someone's like, yeah, he's going to screw up. And there's a great sense of conservatism even among the staff themselves. It's not always just the editors. And so I think that has to change as well. And finally, public service broadcasters have got to just ignore what's written in the media about them because they're generally the ones, because they're funded by the taxpayer, they're coming in for scrutiny for people who don't know anything about broadcasting. So you have to kind of just cut out the noise, understand your strengths, and again, like everybody else, just have small agile projects that in retrospect look like genius. But at the time, everyone in the canteen is going, yeah, right.
I like the dictatorship of the canteen. I'm going to start using that phrase, if I may. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll take one more question, and I'll alert the panel that they should insert into these answers anything that they have failed to remember earlier. Right, we've completely exhausted the extent of failure. Surely not. No, that's it.
Can I ask one question of the audience? How many people here have made a catastrophic failure in their careers?
Well, what are the rest of you waiting for?
Right, ladies and gentlemen, this session is timed for an hour, so we've come to the end of our time. Please thank your panel. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Really enjoyable.
Hey,
Matt, how's it going,
I
man?
have my format feed.
I know, yeah.
How are you doing?
I know.
Hi. What up?
Yes.
Nice to meet you.
Sure, yeah.
I came up with the concept of the failure journalism, by the way.
Did you? I don't go to Jen.
I've even used some of his lines from
Donated, this, I love this detail, the iPhone that he used during the Arab Spring to the American Historical Museum. He's been working since 2014 with, as the founder of Reportedly, part of the First Look group, that's doing global social media reporting. On my right is Mark Little, who probably doesn't need that much introduction to this kind of audience. He worked originally as a reporter for Radio Telefís Éireann, the Irish public service broadcaster. He founded Storyful, social media news agency, if I may abbreviate it like that. It was bought by News Corporation. And Mark now works doing media partnerships for Twitter in Europe and Africa, based from Dublin. We're not going to do open presentations. We're going to do a bit of conversation up here, and then we're going to throw the conversation open. I'm going to assume that both of our guests think that a certain amount of experiment and failure is a necessary and natural thing. I'm going to make a further assumption that there is a bit of a gap, however, between people who talk a good game about experiment and learning from failure and what they actually do in practice. People hate admitting mistakes, however much the management textbooks might say that you've got to experiment to learn and you've got to fail. So I'm going to start with Andy and ask you, Andy, when people talk to you about experiments and failing, what are they likely to get wrong?
I think one of the most common things that they get wrong is that they're going to probably lose their job over failing. It never ceases to amaze me how much reticence there often is, especially among junior to mid-level staffers at news organizations who have the skills and the ideas and the know-how to break the mold a bit and try new things, but are utterly terrified of their editors or their producers because it's been hammered into them that the brand is everything. Always protect the brand. For many years, I was at NPR, National Public Radio, and like many legacy news organizations, protecting the brand is considered highly important. But as I discovered, as I got myself onto certain social media platforms before they did, I figured, well, there's nothing that could go wrong for them because they have zero presence here whatsoever, so why don't I make a fool out of myself as A. Carvin and see where things go? And yet, when I talk to other staff about at news organizations, trying to get them to even try incremental experiments, they want to hold meetings. They want to get all sorts of levels of approval. They basically want something written down to prove that there's plausible deniability to protect them. And it's really unfortunate because I think some of the most exciting things that have happened in social media in the last 10 years were because certain people just didn't give a shit. And they wanted to try things.
Give us an example of something that broke all the rules.
Something that broke all the rules. Well, let's see. Think back to the days of Flickr. Very early on, when Flickr launched, they didn't really know what they were doing. They thought of themselves as a group of friends who wanted to play games online, and they would do it through sharing photos and identifying photos. No one was going to do anything like this online, of course, because bandwidth was such a huge problem. But yet they figured, well, if people are going to be uploading photos to the system as a game, we might as well make it easier for them to organize it. And of course, other companies that specialized in photography and galleries and the like all thought this was a bit insane because, of course, bandwidth would never become cheap or ubiquitous. but they stuck to their guns and became one of the largest photo networks in the world. And now, of course, they're falling apart, which is a whole other set of failures because they were on the cutting edge and then they forgot learning how to adapt. And so it's unfortunately one of the many examples of people who for a period of time are on the cutting edge and are among the people who don't give a shit. But because of incumbent powers and the bureaucracy that often comes around when being purchased again and again and having to appease shareholders, the spirit of wonder vanishes from the organization. And next, you're struggling with whether or no this archive you've been working on for the last 10 years is even going to exist by the end of this year.
So they stopped experimenting?
They got complacent. They could have been Instagram, but they didn't want to do that because who would want to make square photos with filters on them? That, absolute balderdash. And they got completely played by them. And within, 120 days of the company launching, Instagram got bought for $1 billion by Facebook, and Yahoo continues to swirl around the edges of the toilet bowl.
What a terrible epitaph to have on your gravestone. Mark, you're listening to a media executive. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to what I think is probably most people's last session of the day. Not quite, strictly speaking, the last thing on the timetable. Welcome to a session about screwing up. We have started as we intend to go on. We have made our first failure by notching up quite a healthy-sized audience. I'm tempted to ask quite a lot of you to leave, so this session looks like a bigger failure, because failure and the ability to learn from it is our theme this evening. I'm tempted to say that I have a panel of people who are leading world experts in screwing up. That would be unfair. But both members of this panel have done plenty of experimentation and learned from it. On my left is Andy Carvin, who has been involved in more online initiatives, online journalism initiatives than most of us can count. But he came, I think, to worldwide prominence in 2011 when he was curating Twitter feeds about the Arab Spring. He was busy with verification and curation. Somebody christened him the man who tweets revolutions. He has donated